The nation had no idea it was about to witness the clash that would dominate headlines, ignite social feeds, and redefine the boundaries of live debate. Millions tuned in expecting another night of routine sparring, another hour of noise filling the airwaves. Instead, they got a confrontation so raw, so unfiltered, that viewers would later describe it as a turning point, not just in politics, but in how America sees power and voice. Bill O'Reilly sat in his chair like a man who had owned the room for decades. His reputation was carved out of interruptions, quick jabs, and dominance over the conversation. And when the first question left his lips, it was less inquiry and more trap, laced with that familiar smirk, designed to corner, to control, to cut short. Jasmine Crockett began to answer, her tone measured, her words deliberate. She was not rushing. She was building. But O'Reilly couldn't wait. His voice lunged across hers like a fist slamming on a table. "No, no, no, let me stop you right there." The words snapped like a whip, meant to halt her in her tracks. The audience at home shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't just an interruption. It was dismissal, condescension, an attempt to strip the weight from her sentence before it could even land. Jasmine's eyes didn't flinch. She inhaled, allowed the silence to hang, and tried again. Calm, unbothered, anchored in her truth. Yet the unfairness was unmistakable. For viewers who had fought to be heard, who had sat in boardrooms, classrooms, or family tables where their voices were smothered, this moment hit deep. They saw themselves in her. They felt the burn of being silenced. And still, she continued, finding openings between his barbs, refusing to let arrogance dictate the rhythm. It was more than a conversation now. It was a duel. Each time O'Reilly cut in, he thought he was asserting power. Each time Jasmine resumed, she revealed strength he couldn't anticipate. What no one realized, not even O'Reilly himself, was that this tug-of-war wasn't draining her. It was preparing her. Each interruption was sharpening her resolve, loading the chamber for the moment that would shatter the smug certainty across from her. But no one was ready for how she would respond on the sixth try. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to look beyond two people sitting across from each other under studio lights. This wasn't just about Bill O'Reilly and Jasmine Crockett. It was about a culture of media power that for decades rewarded the loudest voice in the room, not the truest. For years, viewers had been conditioned to see interruptions as strength, aggression as authority, and volume as proof of being right. In that studio, every pause, every cutoff, every dismissive smirk represented something larger, the attempt to turn debate into domination and drown truth under the noise of arrogance. Bill O'Reilly was not new to this game. His name was synonymous with sharp elbows, quick temper, and the kind of debate tactics that made headlines less for clarity and more for chaos. He had mastered the art of the ambush, cutting off guests mid-sentence, framing them as weak or ill-prepared, before their words could take shape. For some, it was entertaining television. For others, it was a constant reminder of how easily voices, especially women's voices, especially voices of color, could be bulldozed in front of millions. This was the imbalance at play. On one side, a man who had built an empire by controlling the microphone, by wielding interruption as both sword and shield. On the other, a woman who had climbed into that space not by outshouting, but by outlasting. Jasmine Crockett wasn't merely another guest. She was carrying the experiences of countless people who had been talked over, dismissed, and underestimated. And when O'Reilly leaned forward, cutting across her words with the authority of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, the audience knew they were watching more than a clash of personalities. They were watching truth go head-to-head with noise. For progressive-leaning viewers, the symbolism was electric. Each time O'Reilly interrupted, it was as if he was trying to silence not just her, but the ideals she represented. Justice, equity, dignity. And each time Jasmine patiently reset, it was a signal that those ideals could not be erased. It was no longer a matter of whether she would answer, but how long she could withstand the storm until she turned it back on him. Social media, even in real time, reflected the stakes. Viewers tweeted their frustration, asking why she was being cut off, why he couldn't let her finish, why the networks tolerated a spectacle of silencing. But beneath the frustration was a sense of anticipation. Everyone could feel it building. This was not a woman who would collapse under pressure, This was someone who had walked into the lion's den fully aware of the claws. And that was the danger O'Reilly didn't see. He mistook patience for weakness. He thought control of the microphone meant control of the outcome. But Crockett's calm was not retreat. It was strategy. Each interruption was less a defeat and more a rehearsal, a chance to measure his patterns, to time his arrogance, to prepare a response that would not only land but echo. The stakes had grown far beyond an evening's debate. It was no longer about who spoke louder. It was about who spoke last, who spoke truest, and whose words would endure long after the cameras stopped rolling. But Jasmine wasn't just prepared. She was building to something no one expected. Bill O'Reilly didn't just walk into television, he stormed it. From the very beginning of his career, he carved out an identity that was larger than the stories he covered. He wasn't just the host, he was the spectacle. His brash voice, sharp interruptions, and refusal to let a guest get comfortable turned every broadcast into a battleground. Viewers who agreed with him cheered his takedowns. Those who opposed him often found themselves outshouted, cut off, or framed as incompetent before they had spoken 10 full seconds. In an industry where ratings meant survival, O'Reilly mastered the art of domination. His show wasn't about dialogue, it was about control. Each segment was carefully staged to maintain his authority. If a guest began to gain ground, he would strike with an interruption. If they pushed back, he would raise his volume, punctuating their words with mock laughter or incredulous sighs. For years, this style made him untouchable. He became a symbol of toughness to his followers, the man who didn't take nonsense, the host who always put people in their place. But behind the performance was a pattern: power through silencing. His interruptions weren't random, they were his weapon. By seizing the rhythm of the conversation, he denied his guests the oxygen their arguments needed to breathe. For some, it was frustrating. For others, it was humiliating. Yet the more he interrupted, the more his reputation grew. Networks rewarded him, audiences tuned in, and his image as the unflinching voice of authority solidified. This arrogance became not just a tool, but an identity. O'Reilly thrived on being the immovable force in the room, the man who never conceded ground. His persona told the world, "I speak, you listen," and for decades it worked. He towered over panels, outlasted critics, and turned interruptions into his brand of entertainment. Of course, the controversies followed. Accusations of bullying, charges of misconduct, and an endless stream of critics who accused him of twisting truth into theater. But to O'Reilly, the outrage was proof of success. If people were angry, he was relevant. If they felt silenced, he was winning. The louder the backlash, the louder he became. His empire stood on the foundation of arrogance, and he believed it unshakable. And then came Jasmine Crockett. To O'Reilly, she was just another guest, another opponent to run through the familiar gauntlet of interruptions and dismissive smirks. He saw her not as a threat, but as a chance to reaffirm his dominance. When he leaned in and cut across her opening words, he thought he was replaying a script he'd performed 1,000 times before. Control the rhythm, corner the guest, declare victory. But this was no ordinary guest. Crockett's calm persistence unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. She didn't flinch at his interruptions, didn't raise her voice in panic, didn't stumble into the trap he had laid. Instead, she paused, reset, and resumed again and again. To O'Reilly, it may have seemed like weakness. To viewers, it was something far more powerful. They saw a woman refusing to be silenced, refusing to let arrogance dictate truth. For the first time in a long while, O'Reilly's old tactics began to crack. His interruptions, once seen as clever power plays, now felt desperate. His laughter, once a weapon of dismissal, now looked like avoidance. What had elevated him for decades was suddenly revealing his flaws. His authority was not absolute, it was fragile, dependent on silence from the other side. And Jasmine wasn't giving him that silence. This was the irony of his career. The very tool that built him up, the relentless interruption, the refusal to yield, was about to expose him. When faced with someone who would not break, who would not lose composure, who would not let arrogance define the moment, O'Reilly's power began to collapse under its own weight. Viewers could feel the shift. For years they had seen him steamroll others without consequence. But here, they watched him stumble against a wall he couldn't tear down. Every time Jasmine restarted her sentence, every time she held her ground, O'Reilly's dominance chipped away. The empire built on silencing was meeting the one opponent silence could not defeat, and in that studio, under the glare of cameras, Bill O'Reilly's greatest strength became his greatest weakness. What once made him untouchable was now setting the stage for his undoing. He had no idea that each interruption was not a victory, but a countdown to the moment when control would slip from his hands. But arrogance always underestimates resilience. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin under studio lights, nor does it end with a single debate. Her journey winds through classrooms, courtrooms, and community halls, forged in the fires of struggle and sharpened by the constant demand to prove herself in spaces that doubted her from the moment she entered. To understand why her presence across from Bill O'Reilly mattered so deeply, you have to trace the road that led her there, the road of grit, advocacy, and a refusal to bow. Born into a family that believed in service and sacrifice, Jasmine understood early what it meant to fight for a voice. She didn't grow up in the cushioned halls of privilege. She grew up seeing firsthand how inequality operates, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality. That reality drove her toward law, not as a career, but as a calling. In courtrooms, she found her battleground, where the stakes were measured, not in ratings or headlines, but in lives. As a lawyer, she became known for her ferocity in defending those the system forgot. Tenants facing eviction, workers cheated by employers, citizens whose rights had been trampled. These were the people who filled her case files. And for every win, there were barriers. Judges who doubted her, opponents who tried to belittle her, clients who feared the odds were stacked too high. Yet Jasmine pressed on. She didn't just argue. She embodied the fight for dignity in every case she took. The courtroom was not kind to a young black woman demanding to be heard. The interruptions began long before O'Reilly's studio colleagues, talking over her, senior lawyers dismissing her arguments, juries underestimating her presence. She learned painfully how deeply bias could cut. But she also learned patience. She learned how to pause, how to wait out the noise, how to speak with such precision that her words became undeniable. Every obstacle became a lesson in resilience. Every dismissal an invitation to sharpen her resolve. Politics came next, not because she sought the spotlight, but because advocacy has limits when confined to one case at a time. Jasmine stepped into public service, carrying with her the voices of those she had defended in court. She spoke out against injustice, took on entrenched powers, and refused to let her presence be tokenized or softened. In halls filled with seasoned politicians, she remained direct, passionate, and unyielding. And once again, the interruptions came. Men who cut her off mid-sentence, committees that tried to talk past her, commentators who sneered rather than listened. Each time, she responded not with retreat, but with persistence. This was the crucible that prepared her for O'Reilly. By the time she entered that studio, she was no stranger to arrogance. She had faced it in the courtroom, across the aisle in political chambers, and in every space where being a black woman meant her voice was treated as an intrusion rather than an authority. But she never allowed herself to be reduced. Her strength wasn't just in what she said. It was in the fact that she kept saying it, no matter how many tried to stop her. For viewers who knew her journey, the moment on live television carried a weight that stretched far beyond entertainment. They saw more than a guest being interrupted. They saw a woman carrying the lived experiences of millions. Every pause, every restart, every refusal to crumble represented something larger. The battle of dignity against dismissal, the triumph of resilience over ridicule. Jasmine's voice was not just her own. It was the echo of her clients who had been silenced in court. It was the continuation of community members who had been ignored by policy. It was the embodiment of generations who had been told to stay quiet, to wait their turn, to accept less. She knew that when she spoke on that set, she was speaking for them too, and that awareness gave her a calm strength that arrogance could not touch. What O'Reilly mistook for fragility was in fact the product of years of survival in spaces built to shut her out. He thought his interruptions were new weapons. She had been sparring with them her entire life. And unlike many who had sat across from him before, Jasmine didn't just want to get through the segment. She wanted to hold her ground, to embody the lesson she had lived, that no one can erase you unless you let them. It was this history, this reservoir of patience, fire, and conviction that transformed the confrontation. Viewers weren't only watching her handle interruptions. They were watching the sum of her life's battles converge into one televised moment. Her pauses carried the weight of past silences endured. Her restarts carried the rhythm of every setback overcome. Her measured tone was not submission, it was mastery. So when Bill cut her off again and again, he didn't realize he was sharpening her blade. Every interruption was a strike against stone, and every time she resumed, the edge grew sharper, steadier, more unstoppable. What looked to him like dominance was, in truth, the very act of preparing the counterattack that would leave millions stunned. The first interruption was sharp, sudden, and designed to wound. O'Reilly leaned forward, his eyebrows arched in mock disbelief, his hand slicing through the air as if her words were too flimsy to finish. "No, no, no, that's not what the data says," he barked, his voice louder than hers by design. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a rebuttal. It was a wall meant to stop her in mid-stride. For viewers at home, it was an all-too-familiar spectacle. For Jasmine, it was nothing new. She inhaled, let him spill his noise, and then, calmly, deliberately, picked up her sentence where she'd left off. The second interruption carried more heat. This time he chuckled, shaking his head theatrically, and raised his palm toward the camera as if he were the teacher, and she, the unruly student. "Come on, counselor. You know that's nonsense." The condescension dripped off each syllable. Social media lit up in real time, tweets pouring in, calling him out for disrespect, clips instantly posted with captions like, "Let her speak." O'Reilly smirked at his own performance, but Jasmine did not bite. Her voice didn't rise, her face didn't twitch. She waited out the noise, then returned to her point with the precision of someone who had trained her whole life to withstand worse. The third interruption was pure bluster. He raised his voice even louder, overlapping her words so the transcript itself would be unreadable. You're dodging the question!" His chair creaked as he leaned in, his finger wagging in the space between them. By now, commentators watching the feed were whispering their frustration. A guest on the panel muttered audibly, "Let her finish." The imbalance was becoming visible, undeniable, and the audience felt the tension swelling. Jasmine simply smiled, a subtle curve of the lips, not mocking, not defensive, but the kind of smile that says, "You think you're winning, but you're not." The fourth interruption was the most blatant. He didn't even pretend to engage with her point. He bulldozed, straight through, layering his monologue over hers as if she weren't even there. "Here's the problem with your side," he thundered, turning to the audience as though declaring victory. On Twitter, hashtags flared. "Let Jasmine Speak" trended within minutes, voices rallying behind her in digital unison. Millions felt the injustice in their bones, recalling every time they themselves had been silenced at work, at school, in daily life. But Jasmine didn't show the weight of their expectations. She sat steady, her gaze unwavering, waiting for the space to open again. And when it did, she spoke, measured, careful, carrying not just her truth but theirs. The fifth interruption was laced with triumph. O'Reilly leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and let out a laugh that filled the studio. "You see, you can't even answer the question without spinning." He looked into the camera, as if to signal to his loyal viewers that the battle was already decided. He thought he had cornered her, outshouted her, and sealed her silence with ridicule. In that moment, his arrogance radiated like a victory parade. But the audience at home saw something different. They saw Jasmine's eyes steady, her breathing calm, her posture unbroken. She wasn't defeated, she was waiting. Like a chess player watching her opponent boast about an empty checkmate, she knew the board better than he did. Each interruption had not weakened her. It had strengthened her case. It had rallied public sympathy. It had built a silent momentum waiting to be unleashed. And by the fifth time, O'Reilly thought he had won. The sixth time proved him wrong. The air in the studio had thickened into something almost unbearable. The interruptions, the laughter, the smug dismissal, they had all built toward this moment. O'Reilly leaned back with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won, his smirk fixed, his arms folded like a judge delivering a verdict. The panel shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to move forward or acknowledge the imbalance. Viewers at home clenched their fists, some shouting at their televisions, demanding that Jasmine be allowed to finish a single thought. And then came the pause, the silence that wasn't empty at all, but electric. Jasmine Crockett drew a breath. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't defensive. It was deliberate, steady, and measured. The kind of breath that signals not retreat, but preparation. Her eyes lifted and locked, not on the audience, not on the panel, but squarely on O'Reilly. The gaze was calm, unblinking, disarming in its quiet power. For the first time that evening, the room belonged to her, not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to yield it. When she began to speak, her words carried the weight of everything that had come before. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. And crucially, she didn't allow O'Reilly the room to interrupt. Each sentence was a stone laid with precision, building a wall too solid to break through. Bill, I've listened to you interrupt me 5 times. You've laughed, you've waved me off, you've tried to make my words disappear before they landed. But here's the truth. You don't interrupt because I'm wrong. You interrupt because you're afraid of what happens if I finish. The studio froze. A gasp escaped from the panel's left side, quickly muffled. O'Reilly's smirk faltered just enough to betray his surprise. Jasmine pressed on, her tone even, her cadence deliberate. You've made a career out of talking over people, women, activists, immigrants, anyone who doesn't fit your mold. And for years it worked. People mistook loudness for strength and arrogance for authority. But tonight, you've shown the country something different. You've shown them what fear looks like when it dresses up as confidence. Her voice didn't rise, it cut. It sliced through the air not with volume but with clarity. A calm blade against the noise of arrogance. O'Reilly shifted in his chair, a flicker of irritation darting across his face. He opened his mouth as if to interject, but something in her delivery stopped him. The interruptions that once flowed like reflex now stuck in his throat. Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, anchoring her words. You can keep cutting me off. You can wave your hand, raise your voice, or laugh into the camera. But here's what you can't do. You can't erase the truth. And the truth is this: every interruption only proves my point. Because if my words weren't powerful, you wouldn't be so desperate to silence them. The audience reaction was instant and visceral. Audible gasps rippled through the studio. A woman on the panel mouthed the word "wow" without realizing the cameras were still rolling. On social media, clips of her statement began to circulate before she had even finished. Hashtags spiking, captions exploding. This is history. She just ended him. O'Reilly's composure cracked. He forced a chuckle, the kind of nervous laugh meant to disguise discomfort. He tried to interject, but Jasmine's rhythm was unbreakable now. She had seized control, and the room had shifted in her favor. America is watching this exchange, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. They're watching a man try to silence a woman, again and again, and they're watching that woman refuse to disappear. That matters, Bill. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been told their voice doesn't count. The words landed like thunder. For the audience at home, it was more than political theater. It was validation. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the reversal, the triumph, the transformation of tension into something unforgettable. O'Reilly sat back, his jaw tightening. His silence was louder than his laughter had ever been. The interruption king, suddenly wordless. The man who prided himself on dominance, reduced to reaction. His eyes darted, searching for a foothold, but none appeared. Jasmine had built her wall, and it was impenetrable. The panel erupted, not in noise but in stunned quiet. They exchanged glances that said what words could not. They had just witnessed the breaking of a pattern, the dethroning of a tactic that had ruled political television for decades. Jasmine closed her point with precision, not gloating, not stretching, but sealing the moment with finality. You asked your question, I've answered it. And whether you accept it or not doesn't change the fact that millions of people heard me and they understand. For a moment, the studio was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost sacred. Then came the sound, not from O'Reilly, not from the panel, but from the audience beyond the cameras. Applause broke out, spontaneous and unstoppable, rolling like a wave across the set. It wasn't choreographed, it wasn't polite. It was the release of pent-up frustration, the catharsis of seeing dignity triumph over arrogance. O'Reilly shifted uncomfortably in his chair, forced to sit in the shadow of the moment he had tried so hard to prevent. His usual arsenal, sarcasm, volume, interruptions, was useless against the calm clarity of her words. For the first time, he looked less like the architect of the debate and more like its casualty. The cameras caught everything: his faltering smirk, her unwavering stare, the applause swelling around them. Viewers at home replayed it again and again, stunned not just by what she said but by how she said it. Measured, powerful, undeniable. Instant, Jasmine Crockett transformed from guest to symbol, from participant to victor. She had not just answered a question. She had redefined the conversation. What began as a clash had become a coronation of resilience. And what happened next spread far beyond that studio. The didn't just air, it detonated. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop answer, the moment began ricocheting across every platform imaginable. Twitter lit up first, hashtags erupting with volcanic force. Let her speak. Crockett vs. O'Reilly. Truth uninterrupted. Millions of users replayed the 30-second snippet, their captions drenched in awe. This is how you shut down arrogance. History made on live TV. 6 interruptions, 1 knockout punch. Instagram reels and TikTok edits followed. Some slowed down to highlight O'Reilly's faltering smirk. Others zoomed in on Jasmine's unflinching eyes as she delivered her lines like arrows aimed straight at his empire of noise. On YouTube, reaction channels flooded the algorithm, activists breaking it down frame by frame, commentators replaying it with gleeful pauses, even comedians dubbing it, "The night arrogance lost its voice." But it wasn't just fans and activists. Celebrities began to weigh in. An actress posted the clip with the caption, "Every woman who's ever been silenced just won tonight." A Grammy-winning musician tweeted, "That's what strength looks like, calm, clear, unshakable." Even a few unexpected voices joined the chorus. Political rivals who rarely gave Jasmine public credit admitted, sometimes begrudgingly, that what she had done was remarkable. One conservative pundit tweeted, "Disagree with her politics, but O'Reilly got cooked. Facts." Meanwhile, the opposition scrambled. O'Reilly's defenders rushed online, insisting the clip was being taken out of context, that he had been just doing his job. But the damage was done. Context didn't matter anymore, because the raw footage told its own story. 5 interruptions, followed by a single, undeniable truth that silenced him. Every attempted spin only deepened the impression that his camp was rattled. Mainstream media couldn't ignore it either. Morning shows replayed the confrontation with dramatic slow-motion cuts, anchors shaking their heads at O'Reilly's repeated dismissals. Editorials framed the moment as a cultural turning point. The silenced taking back the microphone, the old guard losing grip on its power. Headlines blared, "Crockett's calm dismantles O'Reilly's fury." When silence backfired, and for millions of ordinary viewers, it wasn't just entertainment, it was personal. Messages poured in from women, immigrants, young activists, even high school students who saw themselves reflected in Jasmine's composure. One viral post read, "I watched this with my daughter. She turned to me and said, 'Mom, that's how you fight without shouting.'" Another wrote, "I've been interrupted my whole career. Tonight, I felt seen." The ripple effects were immediate and vast. Organizers used the moment to rally around broader issues of equity and representation. Activist groups circulated the clip alongside calls to register to vote, to support grassroots candidates, to reclaim spaces historically dominated by louder, older voices. Even classrooms began dissecting the exchange. Teachers using it to illustrate media bias, debate tactics, and the importance of composure under fire. For O'Reilly, the fallout was equally swift. Late-night comedians seized on his silence, replaying the frozen expression with merciless glee. Memes spread faster than his rebuttals, one showing him muted with the caption, "Volume down, truth up." Another compared his interruptions to crumbling walls, collapsing one after another until Jasmine's words stood tall among the ruins. The beauty of the moment wasn't just in the clash itself, but in its undeniable clarity. For once, truth wasn't muddied by shouting or buried under spectacle. It stood there, calm and visible, impossible to ignore. Even critics who despised Jasmine's politics admitted privately she had landed a blow that would be studied in media circles for years. And, as the days rolled on, the aftershocks didn't fade, they multiplied. The confrontation became shorthand for something larger, invoked in speeches, referenced in rallies, cited in op-eds. It transcended the studio, morphing into a cultural touchstone. For a fleeting moment, the endless swirl of noise paused, and clarity cut through like lightning. For a moment, truth wasn't just heard, it was undeniable. When the noise finally settled, what lingered wasn't O'Reilly's bluster or the interruptions that had filled the air like static. What lingered was the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words, a silence not of emptiness, but of recognition. For all the shouting, all the cutting off, all the attempts to drown her voice, it was dignity that had carried the night. Jasmine never once raised her volume to match his. She didn't lean into mockery or pettiness. Instead, she chose patience over provocation, composure over chaos. And in doing so, she revealed a truth as old as struggle itself. Arrogance burns fast and loud, but dignity endures. Viewers didn't just watch her win an exchange, they witnessed a blueprint for resilience. Because the truth is, everyone knows what it feels like to be interrupted, not just in politics or television, but in life. People are cut off in boardrooms, in classrooms, in family conversations where their story is deemed less important. And every time it happens, it carries that sting of invisibility. But Jasmine showed that being silenced doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the interruptions stack up like kindling, and the right words at the right moment set it ablaze. Her answer became more than a defense, it became a symbol. She showed that real strength isn't in dominating a room with noise, but in commanding it with clarity. And the resonance of her moment came from something deeper than political sides. It tapped into a universal yearning, to be heard, to be respected, to speak truth without fear of being drowned out. In the weeks that followed, people replayed her words not just to savor the takedown, but to draw courage. Students preparing for debates, professionals bracing for difficult meetings, activists stepping onto protest lines, all carried that reminder. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to mimic arrogance to defeat it. You win by standing firm, breathing steady, and letting truth do the heavy lifting. It's easy to mistake volume for authority, to assume the one talking loudest must be the one winning. But Jasmine's answer flipped that logic on its head. Her silence before speaking, her calm gaze, her unwavering delivery, those weren't signs of weakness. They were signs of control. They proved that sometimes the most powerful speech comes after the longest silence. And that is why the moment spread beyond headlines and hashtags. It wasn't just a takedown of one man's arrogance. It was a reminder that dignity is still possible in a culture obsessed with noise. That patience is not passivity. That respect for oneself, even in the face of disrespect, can disarm even the loudest opponent. In the end, Jasmine's triumph wasn't measured in applause or retweets, though she earned both in abundance. It was measured in the way people felt after watching her. Stronger, steadier, more certain that their own voices mattered too. She turned a hostile studio into a classroom of resilience, a stage of mockery into a sermon of self-respect. And if there was one lesson etched into the memory of that night, it was this: arrogance can interrupt, disrespect can shout, but truth, spoken with dignity, cannot be silenced. Bill O'Reilly interrupted her 5 times. 5 times he tried to drown her out. 5 times he leaned on arrogance, volume, and dismissal. But her 6th answer? That answer will echo far longer than his interruptions ever could. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reminder that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. In that studio, millions witnessed the clash of 2 forces: arrogance versus dignity, noise versus voice, interruption versus clarity. And in the end, it was the calm, steady insistence on being heard that prevailed. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended everyone who's ever been silenced, sidelined, or talked over. She proved that justice is stronger than arrogance, that one clear voice can rise above a storm of noise. And here's where you come in. If moments like this matter to you, if you believe in voices that refuse to be silenced, in dignity standing tall against disrespect, then don't let this be just another clip you scroll past. Be part of the movement. Subscribe, for more stories where truth breaks through the static. Share this moment so others can see what resilience looks like. Add your voice to a growing chorus that refuses to let arrogance win the day. Because the fight isn't just on TV screens. It's in every room, every conversation, every moment someone tries to tell you your voice doesn't matter. And every share, every comment, every subscriber makes this movement stronger. Remember, it took just one answer to change everything in that studio. One moment of clarity against a tidal wave of noise. And sometimes, one answer can change the conversation forever.